Hey everyone, this is a new lecture series called Photography as Transport in the 19th Century, and I hope to make some parallels between travel photography and other forms of photography that existed in the 19th century. So we'll also look at transport as a photographic concept. So in this section, we'll take a very brief look at daguerreotypes, overview of wet plate collodion process, look at some different world travel photographs, and we'll concentrate on Western American images. So as we begin talking about photography as transport, I want to briefly just remind everyone the process of daguerreotypes, which was a fascination and a craze. It was a worldwide phenomenon, but Americans loved it the best. It had something to do with capturing the American character. It was almost exclusively a portrait medium, although it was used for landscape somewhat, and there was a limited size at the time. It was very difficult to reproduce. Refresher on wet plate collodion process. It was invented in 1853 by Frederick Scott Archer, who was British. This process allowed negatives on glass plates, giving sharp reproducible images. It had to be prepared, exposed, and developed at the time of exposure, so while it was wet. And it was overly sensitive to blue light. And the result was that the blue light from blue skies would overexpose the film in the skylight area. This wet plate collodion process really gave rise to the possibility of travel photography. Also, the paper that it was printed on, albumen printing paper. Remember, it was made from egg whites for silver emulsion of paper. It was a very slow process. It needed a negative to be in direct contact with the paper and for the exposure to happen during sunlight because enlargement was not possible. There was no electricity at this time. So wet plate collodion negative and albumen paper positive was the primary positive-negative combination from 1851 until the 1880s. So as we've talked a bit about this earlier in our class, from around 1851 until the 1880s, there was a newly mobile public that made it possible for world travel. There were steamships, canals, railways, and people wanted pictures from distant places because it was possible, and people were very interested in seeing them. They wanted to see photographs that described places more accurately. And this was being made possible by the wet plate collodion process. So people were using it because it was easier to reproduce than the daguerreotype, and it was sharper than the calotype. So images were shot on wet plates, and they were printed on this albumen paper, which was available for sale in stores, and it was also displayed in galleries. Something called armchair travel exists for the masses now, and that's where people can purchase images that come from across the world, and they can sit in their parlor and they can look at these photographs as if they were traveling to another place in the world. So here again is Oliver Wendell Holmes, a New England Renaissance man. He's from Boston. He's an author, a poet, and a physician, and as you know, he's a transcendentalist writer. So Holmes wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly, which was an intellectual magazine, and the name of the article was A Photographic Trip Across the Atlantic, and it was published in July 1861. So again, try to take a step back and imagine how people of that time might think about these things. So Holmes is writing this piece as he's looking through a stack of photographs in his living room as if he were traveling to all of these sites. And on a side note, 1861, the same year this article was written, is also the beginning of the American Civil War. It's also the very first year that Carleton Watkins visited Yosemite. So he begins the article by referencing an allegory with references to ancient Greece and Rome. And remember, we've talked about this a little bit, about how people were very attuned to this idea of thinking about allegory as a metaphor. It may seem odd to you, but it was not odd to the people of that period of time. So Holmes begins by referencing a book that was written in the 17th century called Wisdom of the Ancients. It was written in 1609, and it was a series of mythological fables. So bear with me while I use a bit of older language as I describe Oliver Wendell Holmes, who says, "There's one fable which Lord Bacon in his book Wisdom of the Ancients has not interpreted. This is the skinning of Marsyas by Apollo. Most people at this time know the accepted version of it, namely that the young shepherd found Minerva's flute and was bold enough to enter into a musical contest with the god of music. He was vanquished, and the story is that the victor fastened him to a tree and flayed him alive. But Holmes' version goes like this. But the god of song was also the god of light, and a moment's reflection reveals the true significance of this seemingly barbarous story. Apollo was pleased with this young rival, fixed him in position against an iron rest, the tree of the fable, and took a photograph or a sun picture of him. This thin film or skin of light and shade was absurdly interpreted as being the cutis, or the untanned leather skin of the young shepherd. The human discovery of the art of photography enables us to rectify the error and restore that important article of clothing to the youth, as well as to vindicate the character of Apollo. There is one less spot upon the sun since the theft from heaven of Prometheus. Daguerre and his fellow adventurers has enabled us to understand this ancient legend. We are now skinning our friends and submitting to be skinned ourselves, every few months or days, by the aid of the trenchant sunbeam which performed the process for Marsyas. All the world has to submit to it, kings and queens along with the rest. The monuments of art and the face of nature herself are treated in the same way. We lift an impalpable scale from the surface of the pyramids. We slip off the dome of St. Peter's, that other imponderable dome which fitted it so closely that it betrays every scratch on the original. We skim off the thin, dry cuticle from the rapids of Niagara and lay it on our unmoistened paper without breaking a bubble or losing a speck of foam. We steal the landscape from its lawful owners and defy the charge of dishonesty. We skin the flints by the wayside, and nobody accuses us of meanness. So this story was about skinning something that you're pleased with and being able to take that skin with you somehow. So Holmes is saying that what is possible with this medium of photography is a literal skinning of the world. That with photography, one can go out in the world and skin off the visual of something and carry it with you in much the same way that you might skin an animal. He goes on to suggest this idea as being analogous to what photography is all about, the lifting of multiple layers of visual epidermis, and that constitutes the visual world. He thinks this is what it is to make a photograph of something, lifting the skin of something. And in doing so, he's suggesting that photography is important as a form of transportation. So I'm going to go on reading a little bit more from Oliver Wendell Holmes. In doing so, these sights gathered from the Alps, temples, palaces, pyramids, are offered to you, reader of Atlantic Monthly magazine, for a trifle, to carry home with you that you may look at them with your leisure. By your fireside with perpetual fair weather, when you are in the mood, without catching cold, without following a guide. In any order of succession from a glacier to Vesuvius. You could look at them for as long as you like, and you, reader of Atlantic Monthly, have hardly troubled yourself to look at this divine gift as if an angel had brought it from some celestial throne. There is only one Colosseum, but how many millions of negatives have they shed? Matter must always be fixed and dear, but form is cheap and transportable. We've got the fruit of creation now, and need not trouble ourselves with the core. Every conceivable object of nature and art will soon scale off its surface for us. Men will hunt all the curios, rare objects, as they hunt the cattle in South America for their skins, and leave the carcasses behind as of little worth. So while he's speaking partially tongue-in-cheek, Holmes is suggesting that it might be possible to actually over-photograph something. And I think several things in response to Holmes' ideas here. One, he's suggesting that it might be possible to wear out certain kinds of photographic subjects in some way. So this really foreshadows the tragedy of people casually confronting scenes without actually paying attention to what they're photographing, because photography is becoming so commonplace, and there is some loss of awe in the face of whatever the subject matter is. So, for example, to travel to China from Boston is a very lengthy journey. But think about understanding how the 19th century person is thinking about this for the very first time. Here's a few embedded questions that you guys can refer to. They will also appear in the study guides that I'll be posting. But take a look at these and remember these particular points of what I've been talking about here. So some of this information will be part of the final exam for this class.